Good morning, and welcome to you all. I'm Ann Hargraves. Roland Kuchel and I are co-chairs of the summer lecture series. There are about 400 people enjoying the series this year. Last week there was about 150 in the house and another 250 watching remotely. We welcome members of our sister programs who are joining us remotely: the Granite State Ollie in Concord, New Hampshire, UMass in Boston, and University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. Just to remind you of the Q&A procedure, those of you in Spalding were given an index card on entering the auditorium. Please write your questions on this card and give them to me and the moderator. We will be over there at the break. There's also a wooden box on stage for you to drop your questions into. For those of you joining us remotely, there's a chat window. If you'd like to give your name and where you are from, submit your questions that way. Thanks to our underwriters who underwrite the whole series: the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Kendall at Hanover, the Village at White River Junction, Wells Fargo Advisors. I'm still selling comic books. Last year, several of our speakers deplored the lack of civics education in our schools. Our first week speaker echoed that. A local organization, the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, has created a comic book which has sold nearly 10,000 copies in educator bundles to schools across the country. Copies of it are available at our registration desk for $5. I recommend it to you. This year, Steve Schema has organized debrief sessions after each lecture. There will be an in-person debrief discussion at the conclusion of this morning's lecture and Q&A. It will begin at 11:45. For those who have registered or who are interested in registering and attending today, please find Osher staff member Diane outside the auditorium at door 1 at the conclusion of this morning's program. Diane will lead participants to the classroom. For debrief sessions in person and on Zoom happening after each lecture, please look for an email announcement inviting you to register. There is no cost for these half-hour stimulating discussions. I would like to introduce Rob Taylor, a member of the Summer Lecture Series Committee, and it is he who recruited our speaker, Mike Smeltzer. I hope he comes.
Good morning. Our lecture series topic this year is challenges to our democracy. Most lectures have focused on domestic challenges. Meanwhile, the dominant news story globally has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine, an attempt to throttle a budding democracy on the border of Putin's autocratic state. We are fortunate today to hear from one of the world's leading experts on democracy and autocracy in the nations that were once part of the Soviet Union. Mike Smeltzer delves into the weeds of governance from Azerbaijan to Turkmenistan. He's young, he's smart, and he's not trying to sell you a book today. Mike is Senior Research Analyst for Freedom House, the leading analyst of democracy around the world since 1941. He's the chief author of the annual report, Nations in Transit, on democratic governance from Central Europe to Eurasia. So he's well prepared for this topic. He has a master's degree in Russian, East European, and Central Asia Studies from Harvard. He got a BA in Russian language and philosophy from St. Olaf College and has lived and worked in Russia. He'll talk about Russia, the region, and the decline of democracy there and beyond. Mike?
Morning, everybody. Good to see you here. Thank you, Rob, for the introduction, and thank you to Osher for this just really wonderful series. I think we often forget that civic education and things like this are really the bedrock of democracy, coming together and talking about these issues that matter to democracy and to our country. And really thank you to the sponsors for putting this on. This is a great thing to support, and I wish we had more of these things around the country. I'm from the Midwest, and I was saying to the group that I had dinner last night, we don't have these in rural Illinois. We need something like this throughout the country where we have deep discussions about the things that are challenging our democracy right now. While my lecture today is going to be rather gloomy, that shouldn't be new news because the last 4 lectures I think have been rather dour. You don't look particularly happy today. But just knowing that you're here and that you care about what's happening in our democracy, that gives me a lot of optimism because it's stuff like this that is what we need to really revitalize our own democracy. But so far you've heard about these challenges that we face in our American democracy, from an electoral system that aggravates anti-democratic extremism to a democratically detrimental media ecosystem with all of these funding problems that you heard about last week, to the ongoing problem of the unequal treatment of people of color. All of these point to the work that still needs to be done to improve our democracy. We are not a perfect democracy, I'm sorry to tell you. We're not the shining star that we once were. And I will dive more into that today. But really, we're going to start by zooming out. We're going to begin with an examination of the state of democracy around the entire globe. And then we're going to zoom in a little bit to look at the specific region that can help us make sense of some of these troubling trends that we're seeing throughout the world. And we're going to do it this way because, as Rob mentioned, I myself serve as Freedom House's expert on Russia and Eurasia, and I can really only speak competently about Southeast Asia or India or Venezuela for about 5 minutes before you realize I don't know what I'm talking about. And so we're going to focus in on a particular region. It's not to say that I think that region is more important. It's definitely more in the news right now. But I do think that it is illustrative of the broader trends of democracy and autocracy in the world. But I want to make sure that you're always keeping in mind what it is that we're talking about during these lecture series. That is addressing the challenges to our democracy. And so I want you to think like a Freedom House analyst today. I want you to kind of step back from your perspective as an American or someone living in America. Today, I want you to think about how America fits into this broader global democratic decline that I'm going to discuss. And I think you're going to hear me say things that sound eerily familiar to what you've heard so far, because the trends that we see in America are present everywhere. And that should concern us. And so today, I really hope to accomplish 2 things with this lecture. One, to make you better informed about what's happening with the global decline of democracy, to lay out these trends that have driven that decline and how they've set the stage for a less democratic and more violent world, one that is frankly all too real for millions of people in Ethiopia and Venezuela and China and Ukraine and millions others. And 2, why this matters for our democracy, why this is a challenge for our democracy. I want to make the case for why we should care about the expansion of global authoritarianism and the rise of these so-called anti-democratic alternatives that we hear about. And because the erosion of democracy globally is not just a human rights crisis. As I'll say at the end, really, if it's left unchecked, it is a grave threat to American prosperity and security. And so this matters to our democracy. This has an impact on our democracy. I'm going to have to remember to keep clicking this thing. But first, I want to talk about Freedom House. So before we get into the doom and gloom of what I'm going to tell you about, I want to tell you about our organization because you may be looking at me and think, who is this young guy and why should I trust him on this topic? What does he know about this? Well, how many of you have heard of Freedom House? Just a show of hands. A third, maybe a half. That's great. I hope all of you will be really interested in the work that we do after I give this presentation. Freedom House is the oldest international organization of its kind in the US. Freedom House was established in 1941, and the mission when they established a Freedom House was to fight back against, I guess, what you might call the America First movement of its time. Namely, this belief in America that the fight against the Nazis was not our fight. That is, America should remain isolationist and not get involved in the war in Europe. And the leaders of Freedom House clearly recognized that that isolationism was a mistake. They understood that the future of democracy in our own country is intimately connected to the freedom of democracy and the future of global freedom everywhere. So our founding patrons were actually Eleanor Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie, the Republican opponent of FDR in the 1940 election. Given what you learned about in the first lecture about partisan polarization, I think it's kind of hard to imagine that happening today. It is really quite astonishing to think about two political rivals coming together from opposite sides and working to advance the cause of freedom, not just in America, but globally. It's kind of impossible to imagine today. And since then, we at Freedom House have advocated for freedom and democracy around the world, as well as here at home. And we do this through a combination of things, from advocacy on the Hill, where we push for greater political rights and civil liberties around the world. We support frontline activists and democracies defenders in many of these difficult places, and we analyze the challenges to democracy that we're facing right now. And it's this last bit, our research and analysis, that we are perhaps best known for around the world. Many of you may have read some of our reports. And indeed, our Research and Analysis Division produces numerous reports and indices that provide insight into the state of democracy around the world. Our best known report, of course, is Freedom in the World. It's our flagship report. It started 50 years ago, and it's aimed at measuring the state of democracy in the entire world. And it does this by analyzing the political rights and civil liberties in the 205 countries and territories around the world. We also have our Freedom on the Net report, which examines, you guessed it, internet freedom. This really agenda-setting report identifies various obstacles to access to the internet, limits on the content that you can post, violations of our users' digital rights. As a non-tech person, it's just fascinating to me, the things that they get into, because it's something that we just don't think about very often, about the threats to our digital rights, and it's becoming increasingly important in today's world. Of course, Freedom House is not the only organization in the business of measuring democracy. There are a whole host of other indices out there and reports that take a slightly different approach to understanding what are really the most fundamental aspects of freedom and democracy. So to name a few, you have VDEM, you have Polity, you have the Economist Intelligence Unit. I just got an email this morning with like 80 more that I had never heard of before. Everybody's doing this work, and it's all important because they each kind of have their own unique methodology. They each are based on some thinking within the political science and democracy community on what makes democracy, and each has their strengths and their weaknesses. And as with any methodology, they have their particular perspective. Working at Freedom House, I will always say our perspective is uniquely useful. We are the ones that have been around the longest doing this, and so we have this depth of expertise that goes back for years. But as an analyst of democracy, I can say that all of these have benefits. I love them all. I've used them all in my research, and I highly recommend that when they come out, you do check them out. But for today, I'm going to talk about Freedom House's work, obviously. I'm going to briefly touch on the research of my colleagues on the Freedom in the World team. I don't work on this project, but I advise for it when it comes to the region that I know very well, Europe and Eurasia. And I'm going to talk about this before I narrow into kind of Central Europe and Central Asia, so you can understand that what's happening in that region is actually happening everywhere. So, Freedom in the World assesses the political rights and civil liberties, as I said, in 210 countries and territories, and we evaluate the state of freedom as experienced by people within specific countries. So we're not rating governments. We're not saying this is a good government, this is a bad government, that's a bad government policy. No, we're focusing on the real world rights and freedoms as experienced by individuals, regardless of whether the impact is coming from state or non-state actors. And we assign basically scores on a 100-point scale that divides the world into free, partly free, and not free. So you can see here that the green countries are free, yellow being partly free, and the purple are not free. And as you can see, there is a shocking amount of purple on this screen. I mean, I look at this and it makes me kind of start sweating. It's clear that democracy is not performing well in the world. And in fact, democracy has been on the decline for some time. We don't talk about it, but we need to. In fact, here's the title of our Freedom in the World report from this year, The Global Expansion of Authoritarian Rule. It's not exactly the most cheery title. Let's look at last year's. Democracy Under Siege. I think you're going to start seeing a trend here, if this thing will work. A leaderless struggle for democracy, democracy in retreat, democracy in crisis. I had to go back to 2006 to find a remotely positive title, Middle East Progress Amid Global Gains. So 2006. And that's because based on our analysis, Freedom in the World has found that global democracy has been on the decline for 16 consecutive years. That should astonish you. That should concern you. So as you can see from this chart here, 60 countries in the most recent year suffered declines in freedom and democracy over the past year. What does this mean in practice? It means we assessed these 25 indicators ranging from government transparency to freedom of movement to freedom of the press, and 60 countries on average saw more declines in freedoms than improvements. And only 25 countries this last year improved, the fewest net improvements since this 16-year decline began. This small number of improvements is a sign that the decline is not reversing. In fact, it is deepening. There are serious things happening here. And the major driver of decline in 2021 that our team identified was that autocrats are increasingly cooperating and supporting each other in their attacks on democratic norms and institutions. So authoritarians, we can see this, how they've made these enormous gains in the international system, from Russia to China to other kind of authoritarian actors that are even within sort of the Western Democratic Alliance. And they're using that influence to promote autocracy as a viable alternative to democracy. This is why the title of this report, of this most recent report, was The Global Expansion of Authoritarian Rule. We're seeing this model being more and more appealing to other countries in the world. And the cooperation that we're seeing amongst these authoritarians, it's not based on a unifying ideology. It's not like we're back in the Cold War and they're all supporting communism versus our democracy. No, it's not about, true friendship amongst these authoritarians. It's based on a single shared interest: staying in power no matter what. That's what they're trying to do to help each other, and that should deeply concern us. And democracies continue to respond to these abuses. We see how they have these sham elections, we see how they have these military coups, human rights abuses, and we pressured them with measures like sanctions and withholding aid of humanitarian sorts. But the impact of these measures that democracies are taking is reduced by this growing economic and political support amongst authoritarians. They're basically able to come together to get around a lot of the things that we are trying to do. And this has real-world consequences. for the majority of people across the globe. 8 in 10 people in the world now live in a partly free or not free country. 8 in 10. That's 80% of the population living in a country that does not provide for full political rights or protect their fundamental freedoms, the freedoms that we all enjoy. And that should be a wake-up call to all of us. You'll see this big decline in 2019. That was when, in our report, India crossed over into the partly free category. Huge population, and as a result, now, roughly 1/8 of the population of the world became partly free as a result of the things happening in India. So this is what's happening at the global stage. But as I said, I'm not going to kind of go around the world and tell you everything that's happening in sub-Saharan Africa or Asia. I'm going to zoom in on my area of expertise, namely Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia. And so I mentioned 2 previous reports, Freedom on the Net, Freedom in the World. We have a 3rd annual report called Nations in Transit, which assesses the state of democracy in the region that we perhaps would call formerly communist. I personally don't like the phrase formerly communist, but I promised Rob and myself that I wouldn't go on a long-winded tangent about why that is. So I'll leave that for Q&A if you're interested. But this report began in the mid-90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Indeed, the very title of this report, Nations in Transit, was built on this supposition that all of these countries would transit from communism to democracy. Obviously, that has not happened. To be fair, how many of you remember that sense of hope in the world when the Soviet Union collapsed, that democracy had won? Remember that just feeling? Yeah, I got a raised hand. I'm going to take your word for it because I was 3 years old. So let's assume that there was that sense of hope. But it was in this sort of geopolitical atmosphere that this report was designed. At the time, those within the academic and democratic democracy kind of practitioner community were thinking about what are the kinds of reforms that these non-democracies need to make to put in place to become democracies. And one line of thinking was that all of these countries need strong democratic institutions. That's all you need. If you have strong democratic institutions, you'll have these sort of necessary foundations for the protection and support of liberal democracy, of political rights and civil liberties. And so the original creators of this report used that thinking to create a methodology for assessing the health of a country's democratic institutions. And they looked at state and non-state institutions like national and local governments. They looked at indirectly or unelected state institutions like the judiciary or anti-corruption bodies, and of course the unelected non-state institutions like the media and civil society. Those of us here, guess what? We all comprise civil society. We're playing an important role in our own democracy. And then, based on those rankings, they assign scores to each of these institutions. A country is determined to be one of 5 regime types, ranging from consolidated democracies at the top to consolidated authoritarian regimes at the bottom. And understanding how these countries are moving on this sort of trajectory from autocracy to democracy, or in more recent years, the other way around. And so I'm in charge of this report, and every year I hire 29 country analysts from the 29 countries assessed in this report. So I'll hire an analyst in Estonia and in Albania and in Tajikistan, and each of them will kind of give us some insight into what's happened to these democratic institutions in the given year. And so our most recent report, Nations in Transit 2022, is looking back at 2021 and what happened. And it's not just the two of us deciding what these scores are. I want to assure you that this is a deliberative and consensual intellectual process, much like democracy, in which we bring in outside experts, we bring in peer reviewers, we bring in academic board of advisors to spend 2 weeks debating Albania's independent media. It is the most fun 2 weeks of my entire life. I love it every year. We get really fired up about democracy, and it helps us come to conclusions about where the democratic trajectory of this region is headed. And so this year's report is titled From Democratic Decline to Authoritarian Aggression. So I started writing this report with my colleague in about late January, early February, because again, this report is about the previous year, about what happened in 2021. We have all these great things that we want to talk about. We want to talk about the flexibility of civil society in many of these places and the rise of hybrid regimes. February 24th hits, invasion of Ukraine. We have to throw out our entire report and start anew, reframing everything that happened in the last year in light of this war, because people needed to understand the context in which Putin and the Kremlin unilaterally decided to invade a sovereign democratic Ukraine. And that's how we get this title, From Democratic Decline to Authoritarian Aggression. I don't explain this very often, but the meaning behind it is not that democracies declining are the cause of the war, though Putin would suggest, oh, look, it's NATO encroaching. Oh, look, it's Ukraine trying to do things against the sphere of influence of Russia. But we are saying that this broader democratic decline that we've seen has created an environment in which autocratic actors like Vladimir Putin feel emboldened to push back on the international rules-based society, that they feel emboldened and that they can get away with invading a sovereign democratic country with no consequences. And so that is kind of the through line over these many years of from democratic decline to authoritarian aggression. And as I said, the global democratic decline has been going on for 16 years, while the decline in this region has been going on for 18 years. It predates this global democratic decline, and in many ways kind of helped set the stage for what happened in other countries. Things that happened in Russia that Putin has done to make it an autocracy have been copied throughout the world by other authoritarians. And so for years now, really, authoritarians have been on the offensive, while liberal democratic practices have increasingly been discarded. We're seeing how domestically demagogues and dictators are really just running roughshod over the rule of law and the separation of power. Elections, which are seldom fair, even when they are nominally free, they take place in these places. They still have elections. They are not fair. They are not free in many of these countries. They use the language of democracy and elections, but they do not respect the spirit and practice of what makes a democracy a democracy. Governments regard the freedoms of assembly, association, expression as inconveniences, if not outright threats to their power, and judicial independence, which has been just long warped by endemic corruption in many of these places, is faltering in the face of abusive lawmaking. And of course, in relations between states, as we see now, conflict, coercion, attacks on the legitimacy of key international institutions, they've proliferated at the expense of good faith dialogue and the search for common interests amongst these countries. And it's these really disturbing trends that are present to varying degrees everywhere in this region, even in the strongest democracies, that have shaped the contours of a new and more violent, less democratic phase of history. Really depressing, I know. Unfortunately, it's not going to get more hopeful from here. So liberal democracy is no longer the presumed form of governance and political development in this region. There was this thinking in the 90s that liberal democracy would be inevitable. Think of Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, right? The whole idea was that liberal democracy would go forward, it would spread everywhere, and there would be no more war and strife and conflict, that would solve it. I will say Francis Fukuyama is doing great work now. You should read his recent book on liberalism and its discontents. I just read it a couple weeks ago. Highly recommend it. Sorry, that's one of the tangents that I end up going on in these things. Rather, the countries of this region are headed in two distinct directions. Now, in the past, we've looked at these countries and said, they're all declining. They're all becoming democratically worse. But this year, we kind of disaggregated the data and said, actually, this region's heading in two distinct directions. One is the full-blown abyss of autocracy. These countries like Russia and Belarus that are just diving to the bottom of the scale as they basically repress everybody in their country. But the rest are headed towards what we call the gray zone of hybrid governance. And while I'll dive deeper into hybrid regimes in a little bit, I just want to say what I mean by that, because some of you may not have heard the term hybrid regime. So in short, hybrid regimes are countries where they combine elements of authoritarian and democratic governance. It's a mix of both, but it's analytically distinct from either. It is not, if you live in a hybrid regime, you'll see things that remind you of being an autocracy or democracy, but it is not the same thing as being a democracy or an autocracy. And so it's really important to understand that this middle zone, which I'm going to talk about, is very important to understand because, as this graphic shows, for the first time since the start of this 18-year decline, the predominant form of governance is now hybrid regimes. It's now these middling countries that mix democratic practices with authoritarian practices. But I'd like to start the discussion actually with the autocracies, because I think, frankly, they're easiest to understand, and it's really in our face right now with the war in Ukraine. So you see how Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine, the horrific abuses and atrocities being committed by the Kremlin, I think it's really reopened the eyes of democracy's defenders to the threat posed to freedom and democracy by unconstrained dictatorship. Entrenched leaders across this region have just full sail rejected liberal democracy and embraced personalist forms of authoritarian rule, in which the state's power is concentrated in the hands of one man. And it is a man, obviously, in all of these countries. Autocrats have just intensified their domestic repression, and they're viewing basically any dissent as a threat to their power. And increasingly, we're seeing how they're turning their sights outside their own borders, as in the case of Ukraine, as in the case of Serbia looking at Kosovo, or Azerbaijan with Nagorno-Karabakh, or Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. There's all of these examples in this region of these autocratic leaders looking out and saying, I want a piece of that. And that should be deeply concerning for everybody, even us in America. So this is going to be a little confusing, but I'd like to show you the scores. So NIT has these scores of all the countries. These are the consolidated autocracies. There's 8 of them. The blue bar is where their scores are now. So you can see that they're all in this sort of 1 to 2 range, and that means they are consolidated autocracies. They are the worst performers of democracy in this region. And some of them, the scores that are the orange dots, that's where they were in 2004, so at the start of this democratic decline. And you can see that many of them have just continued to bottom out. In fact, all of these countries are basically headed towards the bottom of this scale, with Turkmenistan already receiving the lowest possible score, despite the fact that real-world conditions in Turkmenistan continue to get worse. This is a methodological problem for our report, and if you have any ideas how to fix it, let me know. But all we can say is that there is absolutely no democratic character left to any of these institutions within a country like Turkmenistan. And increasingly, we're seeing other countries in this region headed towards that bottom of the scale. And so across this set of autocratic countries, leaders just continue to hold on to power, in some cases for more than 2 decades. You can think of Emomali Rahmon in Tajikistan, Vladimir Putin in Russia, Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus, Ilham Aliyev in Azerbaijan. They've all remained at the top of their power verticals for more than 18 years. Yes, Putin became prime minister for a few years while Medvedev was the president, but really it was Putin at the top the whole time. And this growing trend of personalism is continuing in this region. It's spreading, and it's spreading outside of this region. We're seeing this happen in more and more places around the world. Kyrgyzstan, which is another example of this, you can see that Kyrgyzstan has had a rich history of sort of changes of power. No, they have not always been peaceful, but at least they have had a population that has been kind of used to the idea of changes of power, that there needs to be somebody new every few years to kind of generate democratic ideas about how to fix the country's problems. But in 2021, Sadr Japarov, the president, manipulated voters into basically voting for a rigged referendum that overhauled the Constitution and reinstituted a presidentialist model, which grants him just vast influence over the state of Kyrgyzstan. He has complete control over the parliament, meant to be a check on his power, as well as the judiciary, another check on his power. And let me get a drink really quick. This slide should scare you as well. And as strongman rule has really come to dominate in this region, and in these autocratic regimes, these figures, as I said, have sought to kind of wipe out crucial checks on their power. And they've done this through various means. One of them is the most, I think the most stark example is Russia using this so-called foreign agents law. How many of you have heard of the foreign agents law? Okay, a few of you. So this legislation was implemented about a decade ago that lets the government declare anybody, any like outlet or civic organization receiving funds from abroad, they can declare them as a foreign agent. And in practice, this makes it very difficult to do their work. And over time, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin have just intensified this law. They've used this indiscriminately, including amending it in 2019 to not just civic organizations and independent media outlets, but even individual journalists. So if an individual journalist is reporting on something and they're getting, I don't know, money from me, I donate to an independent newspaper in Russia so they can do this important work, they can be declared a foreign agent because I, as an American, want to support them in the work that they're doing in Russia so I can stay abreast of what's happening in Russia. And now the Kremlin can designate them as a foreign agent, which holds all of these restrictions on their rights as individuals. And this graphic here really shows the dramatic increase in the use of this legislation to target these outlets and journalists and organizations in the last year. You can see how it just dramatically jumped up in 2021. And that's because 2021 was just a year of really historic, monumental repression in Russia. You can think of the beginning of the year with the arrest of Alexei Navalny, Putin's primary political opponent, to the end of the year with the closure of Memorial, Russia's oldest human rights civic organization. This organization existed in the Soviet Union. Like, it was allowed to exist at the end of Gorbachev's reign and at time in power, and even Putin is shutting it down. Like, that should really scare us about the democratic trajectory of this country. And of course, this repression has only intensified as the war in Ukraine kicked off. I mean, 15,000 Russians have been jailed, if not more, for simply speaking out against the war. By using the very word war for the first few months, you could be thrown in jail for 15 years. And they've only increased this law, they amended it again just a few weeks ago, to now basically, you don't have to receive money, you don't have to receive sort of training from the West, just by talking to somebody in the West can get you declared a foreign agent and make it impossible to do your job. And this is not just happening in Russia, this is happening in all of these autocratic regimes. They're learning from each other, they're copying each other's legislation and tactics, and not just in this region, it's happening in China, Venezuela, elsewhere. So what's happening here in this region is really important for what's happening elsewhere. But let's get on to what is now the largest category in NIT, which are the hybrid regimes that I mentioned. In 2004, there were there were only 4 hybrid regimes, and now there's 11. It's almost tripled. My colleague Noah, who wrote this report with me, he likes to think of them as, when you think about hybrid regimes versus autocracies, the difference there, in an autocracy like Russia, they just shut down independent media. They just say, nope, you're not going to do your job. In Hungary, Orbán will have his allies buy up those independent outlets and then slowly chip away at the independence of those outlets, having them give more and more positive coverage to those in power while limiting the coverage of anybody seeking to combat Orbán's rule. And this is what it's like to live in a hybrid regime. So let's look at the scores again. The blue bars here represent the democracy scores. And in this survey, hybrid regimes fall between 3 and 4. So all of the blue bars are there. One country should stand out to you. Hungary was once a strong, consolidated democracy, and really over the past 18 years, and especially the last 12, since Prime Minister Viktor Orban has come into power, it's fallen from one of the strongest consolidated democracies in the region to a hybrid regime. And so far, while Hungary's trajectory is unique in that it is, kind of fallen the furthest, Orban's model of this illiberal democracy has spread to other countries in the region, including Poland and Slovenia and Serbia. All of these other countries that were once democratic have kind of taken on this model, and it's deeply concerning. Orban, by the way, is giving a talk in Texas today. Many of you may know this. He's speaking at CPAC. He is the guest of honor or primary speaker today at CPAC. He met with Donald Trump a couple of days ago. It should deeply concern you that the political establishment of one of our political parties is willing to do business and give honor to a guy who just a couple days ago said that Hungarians should not be race mixing with people outside their own country. This is an autocrat in our own country right now giving speeches to Americans about how we should run our democracy. Sorry, I got a little political there, but I'm very fired up at the moment. But let's get back to the slides. The number of hybrid regimes counted, like I said, has tripled because it's proven impossible, almost, for these countries to exit this zone. In fact, the way my colleagues and I like to talk about it is this has a gravitational pull. Once you kind of fall into it, there's really no getting out of it. There is a silver lining to this, of course, that none of the formerly authoritarian countries, here you have Kosovo, Armenia, and Moldova. If you go further back in time, you can think of Ukraine and Georgia as formerly authoritarian. None of them have fallen back out and into full authoritarianism. They've kind of skirted on the edge. And that's no mean feat. That really should be celebrated, that they have continued to push back on full-blown authoritarianism in their country. But we know that there's a better system of governance out there. Democracy, right? It would be great if all of these just became democracies. So it's a problem that none of them are becoming democracies. And the question is, how do countries exit this gray zone? How do they get out of this gravitational pull? And we're not great at coming up with solutions on my team. I was telling my dinner host last night that, I just tell you what's going wrong. I can't really tell you how to fix it. But I think that in this case, it's pretty clear what you need to do to get out of the gray zone of hybrid regimes. It's elections. That's the viable option to get out of this. Have an election where you bring in reformers who will put forth democratic reform processes. That's all you got to do. Probably because it's really it's the best way. I mean, if you think about how else you change the governance system of your country, you have regime change, you have revolution. They're not exactly happy ways to go about changing your country. They're very deadly, they cause a lot of trouble, and they often don't go the way that you think they're going to go. You can look at Russian history for a great example of that. And crucially, all of these countries do hold elections. They are not fair, they are not free, but they are competitive. To use a sports analogy, competing against an incumbent in a hybrid regime, it's like playing against the 1992 Dream Team. You'll probably lose, but at least it's still a game. And there are cases in which we've had breakthrough elections, in which coalitions or parties have unseated long-standing authoritarian parties that have been in power for 30 years or more. So you can see a few examples here of countries that have had these breakthrough elections. That's the red dot, the year in which they've had. And other than maybe North Macedonia, none of these have really increased their democracy much after these elections. And the reasons for that are really interesting and really troubling. And it explains why there's a gravitational pull to this region. So let's say you come up with a coalition of multiple parties looking to unseat an autocrat or a hybrid regime incumbent like Orban or Vučić. You have all these parties come together, you win, and you have to put together a reform platform. You've got far-right parties, far-left parties, center-left, center-right, all in one coalition. There's no way they're going to agree. And time again, we've seen these coalitions break down squabbling over what to do with the future of their country, and the authoritarians come back in power. You also have a problem with, even in cases where a single democratic party comes into power, like in Armenia. They had a revolution in 2018 where they kind of threw out the authoritarian old guard in the national government. Pashinyan starts these democratic reforms, and he comes up against the judiciary. The judiciary has been basically planted with old guard, conservative judges who just undo all of these reforms that Pashinyan and his colleagues are trying to put through to make Armenia more democratic. And of course, in many of these places where they have elections and win, they not only have to put through reform processes to make it more democratic, they have to undo the rot and corruption of the previous regime. So it's a double challenge, and it's incredibly hard because these election cycles are sometimes 1-2 years, and you cannot do that work in such a short amount of time. At the same time, it's what has to be done, and it requires citizens like us to support them through this difficult, arduous process that we recognize is going to take time. If you're interested in this, my colleague Noah wrote all about this. He's been studying this for years. He loves this kind of stuff. I highly recommend that you read the essay on this. But let's turn last to the democracies in this region. I'm probably going close to time. The democracies. There are still democracies in Central and Eastern Europe. All is not well. I'm so sorry. I don't have any good news for you. Even the comparatively strong democracies of Central Europe and Eastern Europe have not been immune to this democratic decline. So if we look at the scores again, it's clear that Poland's score stands out, having fallen quite far over the past 18 years, particularly since 2015 when the Law and Justice Party came into power. It's almost unparalleled. It's actually declining at a faster rate than Hungary did over its period. So Poland is deeply concerning to me right now. But this chart can be deceptive, because while it would appear that many of these countries have stagnated or suffered kind of modest declines, what's remarkable and alarming is really that none remain in this highest score band from 6 to 7, which is reserved for the countries that embody the best of democratic practice and principle and norms. None of them are there anymore. That's pretty concerning. And citizens in these countries are clued in to this fact. They know that even amongst the top performers in these surveys, that democracy isn't really working for them. And it's helping this idea of an anti-democratic alternative. In fact, there are only 3 countries of the 10 democracies where a majority of citizens are satisfied with the way democracy is working. In 7 of 10, majority of citizens are dissatisfied with how democracy works in their country. I mean, I imagine we would have similar numbers probably here in America. We would probably be pretty dissatisfied with how democracies were performing right now. And so it should not come as a surprise that as citizens are saying their democracies are not performing, that in fact their democracies are not performing. 8 of the 10 countries that are democracies declined in their democracy scores in the last year. The question, of course, is why? What is causing the decline in democracies? It's not like they have authoritarian leaders that are just instituting executive orders like Putin or Orban. Like, they have strong democratic institutions. So what's driving this decline in the democracies? And I want to highlight 2 forces. 1, corruption, and 2, illiberalism. So corruption, that is well known to all of us, it continues to be the most glaring weakness in basically this entire region. As you can see here, these are the average indicator scores for each of the 7 things that we analyze, and broken out by the different type of regimes, autocracies, hybrid regimes, and democracies. And you can see that the democracy's lowest indicator on average is the corruption score. This is a problem that has been left unaddressed for 2 decades or more. Basically, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain came down, they just haven't addressed some of these democratic deficiencies within their anti-corruption system. In a place like Latvia, if you're an oligarch who has done corrupt things and has been is being attempted to be prosecuted by the prosecutorial services or anti-corruption bodies, you can basically rig the system to just let your case sit in limbo for 15, 16, 20 years, and you can get away with it and not be prosecuted, not have to go to jail for this. And they do this in many of these countries. And that's why these scores are so low, because the corruption is not being prosecuted, because there's just not this push to reform these systems. And the second thing that I mentioned was, of course, illiberalism, which often provides cover for corruption in many of these places. It's driving the decline in these democracies. And I want to be clear, because as an analyst, I think it's really important that we be clear what we're talking about with our terms. So when I say illiberalism, I'm not talking about policies that I just don't agree with. I'm not talking about policies that the Democrats support versus the Republicans support. Illiberalism is an ideological stance that rejects the necessity of independent institutions as checks on executive power and government. It professes zero tolerance for legitimate disagreement in the public sphere. These are things you need in a liberal democracy. You need checks on power. You need to be able to have discourse in a civil manner where, yes, you're going to disagree, but that's part of being in a democracy. And increasingly we're seeing leaders in some of these democracies rejecting that idea that there's room for this debate. So you can think about a country like Slovenia, where last year the former prime minister, he eventually got thrown out of office, Janez Janša, he would get on Twitter and basically harass everybody from the press to the judiciary to Freedom House. He'll get on there and tell us that we're wrong. That should not happen in a democracy. I'm sorry, your leaders should not be spending their time attacking the democratic institutions that are there for a reason, to check their power, to watch them. These institutions exist. And you can also think about a place like Poland, where the government has used this politically captured constitutional tribunal to basically reject human rights guarantees that are in the foundational EU treaty. They've created a court that lets them basically ignore EU law and lets them reject human rights across the country. And so, as I said, these are our conclusions from 2021. 2022 is not much better. I'm sorry. This is the stage that was set for 2022. This is the from democratic decline to authoritarian aggression. And already this year, we've seen how war in Ukraine, massive protests in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, protests about gas prices led to nationwide protests, which then were co-opted by a dictator to overthrow his successor to gain more power, to consolidate power. And yes, he's promising democracy and all this stuff, but we have yet to see it. We have seen how populist authoritarians have won in Hungary and Serbia. Orban and Vučić won decidedly in their elections already this year. And the economic instability that's going to cause even more chaos and trouble and strife in this region. We've seen how Putin's unilateral decision to invade a sovereign democratic country has caused our own gas prices to go up and our own inflation to go up. Yes, he's not singularly to blame for our economy and what's happening, but it is a role in why things are the way they are right now. And while we're complaining about 8 and 9% inflation, in parts of Europe it's 15%, 18%. Gas prices in Moldova are 6 times what they were before the war. He is unilaterally deciding the economic trajectory of this country, which has an impact on people's support for democracy in this country. There is some good news. We have seen unity and support for a democratic Ukraine. I think many of us are a little surprised at how the coalition has stuck together to support Ukraine. We continue to send arms and push back and maintain the sanctions against Russia. Yes, they are still selling their oil and gas to Europe. It's complicated, as all things are, but there is this unity because we recognize that if Putin wins, that the international rules-based order that was developed after World War II and that was meant to check the ability of imperial-minded leaders like Putin, if he wins, that comes back. Empires can decide what happens in the rest of the world. And so while I said I'm not good at telling you what we should do, there are a few things that we can think about what can be done, including restricting the ability of authoritarians to co-opt the system that we've created. So this means addressing financial crime loopholes and applying targeted sanctions against human rights abusers as part of a comprehensive foreign policy. But it also means fixing our ailing democracies and aiding those would-be democracies, those that really want to become democracies. And it's this last bit, I'm going to bring it home now, that I think is really important for addressing those democratic deficiencies at home, because that's the focus of this series, right? Addressing our democratic deficiencies, addressing the challenges to our democracy. And indeed, our democracy, as you've heard the last few lectures, has without a doubt been suffering. According to our team's research, American democracy has declined over the last decade for a number of reasons that you've already heard, as well as some listed here: punitive immigration and asylum policies, lack of transparency in government. Should concern you that the Secret Service doesn't want to give away their texts. They work for us. Political corruption. All of these things are causing our democracy to decline. Maybe it doesn't impact us on the individual level right now, but it does in the long run, because democracy protects our basically like private wealth and economy. Like, it is the basis by which we can live individual lives. It gives us liberty. But so we've seen the decline domestically. We've seen the decline globally. It's all connected. What happens in America affects the democratic trajectory of the rest of the world. We play a role in supporting democracy elsewhere. And when we have non-democratic or anti-democratic people in power here, it pushes back on our support of democracies elsewhere. And of course, we can see now how the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine is having an impact on our own and other countries. Again, from these rising gas prices to food shortages that are causing starvation in Africa. And so the point that I want to really end with is that the erosion of democracy is not just a human rights crisis. It's not just, people suffering out there. Left unchecked, it's really a grave threat to international security and our own security and prosperity, right? The decline of democracy is going to bring about a whole deterioration of the international rule of law, the things that have kept us safe since the end of World War II. And we just know that the U.S. is more secure when democracy prevails around the world. It's no accident that this country's strongest and most reliable allies are democracies, while our most dangerous adversaries are autocracies. And Freedom House's founders knew this well. This is why we said we need to go into this fight against the Nazis. We need to support democracy where it is. And frankly, just international cooperation, commerce are easier when all sides respect democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. By contrast, hybrid regimes are just operating through coercion and corruption and deceit at home and abroad. And so we must act. This is also a call to action. I'm always ending with a call to action. We can support democracy at home and abroad. And actually, there's no one that I feel that understands that better than a young Ukrainian student at Dartmouth. Marta Julievska she's been featured in the most recent Dartmouth alumni magazine. There's an interview of her. She is a rising sophomore at Dartmouth. She is part of the Ukrainian Students Association that has been fundraising for the relief effort in Ukraine. They initially were starting by helping get funds for Ukrainian student families in Ukraine that had to flee their homes. And Marta actually is my intern at Freedom House. And we talk about this stuff every day. And she, being, 18, 19 years old, is so clear-eyed about what needs to be done, about the threat posed by autocracy. I think she sees this more clearly than 80% of Americans right now. And so I highly recommend that you go online and read this alumni magazine interview of her, because it really is very stark what she is talking about. So you can see this quote here of what she would like the alumni at Dartmouth to know, and it's that you can make a difference. Like, you can still impact the trajectory of this war by doing two things, she says. One, talking to your representatives. You have a voice. They are your representatives. Talk to them and tell them to continue to support Ukraine. And 2, to provide aid. And she, in this case, says specifically to the Ukrainian military, not to refugee associations in Poland or Romania, but to the Ukrainian military, because the way to end this war and to prevent more refugees is to help Ukraine win this war. To stop the suffering is to help Ukraine win this war. And with that, I just want to say thank you for this really wonderful opportunity. I've thrown our team email on here. You'll all get the slides, and I included a link to donate to the Ukrainian Student Association and the fundraiser if you want to donate to Marta and her team's work. So you'll get those slides sometime later, and you can donate to the great work that they're doing. And that's for a Dartmouth student right now. So support your own community here. Thank you. Looking forward to the questions, and let's get some cookies.
Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a nice break and a little bit of coffee and cookie. And now I'd like to reintroduce our speaker and our moderator, Rob Taylor.
Hello again. I look forward to the day when somebody invents a mask that doesn't take your hearing aids off. So we had a lot of questions. Thank you, those of you who contributed questions about this wonderful topic. I'm going to start with one that looks at your Freedom House reports. This is unsigned, but it says, do you think that your democracy scores in your next report might be more positive for the region because of what's happening in Ukraine? This adds, will these countries not realize what happens if democracy is lost?
Short answer, no, the scores will not be better, obviously. It is an interesting question to ponder, though, because we are seeing, as I said in one of my slides, a lot of unity in support for Ukrainian democracy. Even declining democracies like Poland are coming to the support of Ukrainian democracy. But I think it's incredibly important to not only see what they're doing in terms of their foreign policy, but also their domestic policy and how they're addressing, while they're at one hand trying to save Ukrainian democracy, are they at the same time trying to address the democratic deficiencies within their own countries? And it's not positive in many of these places. And again, it's only August. There's many more months of this to go, and I'm deeply concerned about what the continued impacts of this war will be on support for democracy in the long term, as Moldovans and Lithuanians and Polish people have to deal with the consequences of this war. If Russia shuts off the gas in December, there will be serious political and social upheaval in many of these countries that will have consequences for democracy in these countries. And so it's hard to be optimistic at this moment about the democratic trajectory in this region. And one thing, thinking about Ukraine's scores that I'm struggling with right now is often these scores are an assessment of what is happening internally in a particular territory and how the governments and these various institutions are promoting or dismantling democratic institutions. But in this case, we have an outside state actor determining the democratic trajectory of an independent sovereign state. And is it really fair to assess Ukrainian democracy when they can't even control their own democracy because they're being invaded? I think it raises some really interesting questions for us at Freedom House to think about going forward.
We have several questions about how U.S. policy should deal with the decline of democracy elsewhere. One refers to the Gorbachev era in Russia. It says, while Gorbachev held power and Russia was a would-be democracy, he asked for help in the form of money from the U.S., Bush Sr., and Scowcroft. Essentially declined to help. I'm not sure that's correct. Had we lent meaningful aid, would anything have turned out better in Russia? This is from Dave.
That is such a good question and a great counterfactual that is impossible to answer, unfortunately. No, it's a really good question, and there's lots of debates about what we could have done differently in the late 80s, early 90s, because there was a lot of U.S. support going towards a budding democratic Russia in the early 90s after the collapse. I mean, we were working with them very closely to kind of move them in the right direction, to get them the IMF funds they needed to build a market economy in Russia. The problem was that unfettered capitalism in a country that has never had the experience of capitalism, they didn't have the institutions that are meant to check some of these excesses of capitalism. And so you had this situation where you have these oligarchs buying up all of this formerly state-owned infrastructure, whether it be gas companies, whether it be independent media outlets, all of these things that are important parts of Russian society. And we didn't do a great job of, apologies, this is the fly on the stage, of kind of checking those excesses and really making sure that we were doing our due diligence in helping them work through some of these thorny problems. And over time, the relationship soured. You can look at NATO involvement in Kosovo in the late 90s and how that really began to sour kind of U.S.-Russian relations. I mean, Russia and NATO had, NATO was working towards becoming part of, or Russia was working towards becoming part of NATO, or at least allied with NATO. We had this sort of Russia-NATO founding treaty that they were working on. And so there have been a lot of mistakes along the way, but that doesn't, I want to say that doesn't excuse some of the authoritarian tendencies and trajectory that we've seen many of these leaders in Russia take over the years. So, you can't blame the West for the path that Russia has, that the Kremlin really has chosen to take Russia on.
Well, in fact, American economists led the charge towards the fire sale of Russian assets to oligarchs.
Yep.
On the other hand, I can't remember which president it was, but the U.S. contributed significant finance to Russia to safeguard nuclear materials after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that was one area in which we...
Megatons to megawatts.
Yeah.
Actually, my girlfriend's father is writing a book on that right now. So I will recommend that to you all once it comes out.
Somebody who took a very broad view of the world said, should the U.S. commit to long-term protection of democracy in Taiwan, Ukraine, elsewhere? Are there no limits?
We had a discussion about this last night, didn't we? Of whether the U.S. should be the policeman or police officer of the world, right? And what is the role of the U.S., especially given what happened within Afghanistan the last 20 years? Clearly, we didn't do a great job in helping Afghanistan become a strong democracy. And it's a serious question of sort of what is the role of U.S. foreign policy in supporting democracy around the world. And we talked about how support can either come, you have to kind of pick a priority within your foreign policy, whether it be one that's human rights focused primarily, or whether it's national security focused primarily. And I tried to make some difficult argument that they can both be a priority. But it's a good question. But I think it's the argument that I was trying to make today is that it's actually in our national security interest to see a democratic Ukraine, to see a democratic Taiwan, to help democracies, supporters in Hong Kong. Because if we stop supporting a country like Ukraine in its fight for its own democracy, what does that do? What does that tell the rest of the world? It tells the rest of the world that autocrats and would-be czars and kings can do what they want with the world. They can make the world however they want. They can invade a sovereign democratic country and do what they want with it. And we decided after World War II that we were not going to live that way anymore. We were not going to let an individual country decide the future of other countries. And so by not supporting these countries, you kind of leave them to the whims of these authoritarian actors. And so it's a difficult balance between letting them set their own trajectory, letting them decide for themselves of what their democracy looks like, what their governance system looks like, while at the same time recognizing that we do want to support their democracies because it keeps us safe as well. So it's such a challenging question, and I hope our government is thinking about it right now. It seems to me they are.
Was it a mistake for the U.S. not to react more aggressively after Russia invaded Crimea and seized it away from Ukraine in 2014?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we remember, right? We were talking about this last night of, I asked this question of how long has this war been going on, and we all said 5 months, and then I said, well, no, it's really been 8 years and 5 months. We have to remember that Russia has been at war with Ukraine since 2014 when they invaded. The little green men went into Crimea and they started this separatist movement, supported the separatist movement in the eastern Donbass. And it's, to a certain extent, we did not dissuade Putin. We did not show fulsome support for Ukraine and created a situation in which, yes, we sanctioned them. Yes, they were able to, they took some hurt from the sanctions. They lost a little bit, but they also learned how to react for the next invasion. And so you hear people talk about Fortress Russia and kind of building up some independency within the country to withstand future sanctions. We can talk about sanctions all day if we want, but it's pretty clear that the lesson that Putin learned was, well, I can get away with taking parts of another country, and the collective democratic West is not going to step in and stop me. So if that's a mistake, it's hard to say whether or not that's a mistake, because the counterfactual is we do step in, and then that creates a war with a nuclear superpower. So there's really no good answer.
Well, some of our questioners are focused on today's news. Roseanne from Boston writes, I suspect that Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan's democracy was a message to China that a Ukraine-like attack would be not be ignored. Would you agree?
They're definitely trying to send a message. I will say Nancy Pelosi is not the only congressperson to visit Taiwan. We've had other congresspeople visit Taiwan over the years. It is different, I guess, when the Speaker of the House visits. It's a higher level visit, but it does signal support. And I think that has that support for Taiwan's democracy and being there, it may seem pointless to some in America. Like, why poke China? Why even make them angry when they've expressed dissatisfaction? The question, of course, is, should China be able to decide the foreign policy of Taiwan? And by simply going And visiting Taiwan and meeting with officials there, we as America, through Nancy Pelosi, are signaling that no, Taiwan should be able to decide and determine its own path. And that if they want to have us visit, that is their decision, that China does not get to decide the future of this country. And so, it's a question of to what support we would provide if China did invade, but I think it's nevertheless really important that we continue to provide even symbolic support. It makes a difference in the world. Soft power is important in the world. It's not just all might versus might.
Well, let's turn it around to Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia. He's been widely criticized for visiting a country that's clearly an autocracy and one that it seems to be becoming more autocratic all the time. Should he have gone?
Personally, I think he shouldn't have gone. That's just me personally. I think it sends the wrong message. At the same time, the world is complicated. Our allies are not the most democratic states all the time. Saudi Arabia is a great example of that. And there is a certain extent of realism within U.S. foreign policy that says we need to keep our allies no matter who they are. And so it's Freedom House and other organizations like us that are supporting human rights and democracy will continue to call out our leaders when they are seen gallivanting with MBS or Putin or Orban. We should continue to call them out for these things. But ultimately, it's our leaders' jobs to determine whether it's in our national interest to continue to have these relations. And we as a society should decide that as well. Like, it's up to us. If we don't want Biden going to Saudi Arabia, then we should elect somebody who says, I won't go to Saudi Arabia. Like, we have a voice in this as well. It's often hard to remember that. And we can continue to kind of call out, even if our leaders need to push what they think is best for American foreign policy, we as individuals can still have our voice and call out these autocratic leaders who kill journalists. We all have a role to play in this as well.
I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience about public opinion in this country. How do we control elements in our own country who sympathize with autocrats and hybrid regimes throughout the world? I'll read the second part of this, particularly when those elements have support among much of our population and may succeed in winning an election.
I don't know. Yeah, if anybody has any answers to this question, you're welcome to take the mic away from me. I'm not an expert on the U.S. situation, but I can talk about my own experience in doing this. So I do these kind of lectures when I go home to Central Illinois, which is very rural and is more right-leaning than perhaps this group is. And I will give talks like this and talk about democracy and why it's important to support democracy, why it's important to push back on authoritarianism. And I think one of the best ways to kind of have these conversations and kind of make them understand why we shouldn't be moving towards an autocratic system, why it doesn't work, is bringing it home, making them understand how the foundations of liberal democracy were developed to secure private property rights of individuals. If you live in an autocratic regime without the rule of law, anybody can come and take your house away from you. Anybody can come and take your property away from you. And so appealing to people's self-preservation and sense of self, I think is really important for democracy. That liberty, the liberty that we have because we live in a democracy, is not something that you would have in an autocratic regime. And so while I have acquaintances who will say, well, it's no different in America, free speech is no different in America than it is living in Russia, I will say, okay, so you will say, let's go Brandon, If you said something like that in Russia, you would be arrested. If you said, F Putin, you would be thrown in jail. Has Biden thrown you in jail for saying, let's go, Brandon? No. That is an example of how this is quite different. And so kind of helping people understand really what it is to live in an autocracy. This bug is very interested in me right now. It's Putin's spy or something. God. I think just kind of helping people really get back to that civic understanding. Yeah, I think it's the cookie. I have like really sweet blood right now or something. Almost got it. Yeah, and so kind of just helping people get back to the basics on why democracy is important for everybody, including individuals. Like why it's important for you as an individual, as a self-interested, selfish, egotistical person who only cares about themselves, because we all are that, we're humans, why it is that we've set up this system of democracy to help us deal with conflicts amongst individuals, and how in an autocratic system, you are subject to the whims of one person. So it's tough. It's tough. I wish I had a better answer.
Another question about public opinion. Will Freedom House buy some time on Fox TV and major networks to get their message out to the Trump world?
I don't know that we'll buy any TV time because we're a nonprofit, so don't have a lot of money. If you all want to donate to give us TV time on Fox News, I'm sure we'd take it. But really, we do engage with all sides of the political spectrum, because this is not, as much as democracy and human rights have been politicized in America, it nevertheless, we believe that it's not a partisan issue. And we're going to continue to be nonpartisan or bipartisan in our efforts. And so we have some of our more senior execs have gone and spoken on Fox News. When our reports come on, we go on and talk on the news. Sure, we're not going on Tucker Carlson, who called out Freedom House like 6 months ago and said we were Soros stooges or whatever. But we still do go talk to the various journalists. I mean, they reach out to us and want to know what we're thinking on these things. And we do work with Republicans within Congress. They care about what we have to say. We work with them because a lot of these things that happen in the world need to be addressed on a bipartisan basis. So we worked really hard, for instance, to get the Global Magnitsky Act passed with both Democrats and Republicans on the Hill to go after authoritarian actors and human rights abusers in the world. There is still room for this sort of compromise and dialogue in American society. Yes, there are some people that are completely brainwashed and you will never get through to. They're the people that I argue with on Facebook every day. But still, I guess I'm of the opinion that it's still worth trying and having these conversations with all political perspectives. Because within a democracy, you have different ideas, right? It's really boring if everybody agrees. Democracy doesn't work that way. Democracy is built upon the idea that we have different ideas of what is good, and democratic institutions help us kind of figure out how to arrange society in which we have people with different definitions of what is good. You can have different people respecting different religions, people having different ideas about how we should do social spending, people having different ideas of how much we should spend on the military. The problem comes when you start viewing the other side as the enemy and no longer leaving that space for good faith dialogue and kind of respect for the other. And we're increasingly, unfortunately, seeing that, where we kind of demonize each other in our own country and see the enemy within. And it's deeply concerning. And my suggestion, this is what I said last night, the solution to these problems of democracy is always more democracy, more talking, more voting, more mobilizing, more petitions. Like we just saw in Kansas, people were really unhappy with the Dobbs decision. And what did they do? They mobilized, and they got 70% of the state to support the rights of women. Like, we can do that. It just takes work. We're not going to have the political leadership behind us because they have their own incentives. But we, as Americans, still have all of the rights that we always had. We just need to use them to further democracy in our own country.
That was like a campaign speech right there. Would you all vote for me after that? Yeah? Okay.
Please discuss the democratic trends in Ukraine between the election of Zelensky and the Russian invasion. I think I saw that the Freedom House score hasn't changed much in the last few years.
Really, really good question. Right now, at least on our nations in transit scale, Ukraine is listed as a hybrid regime. And Ukrainians are not happy with that. I myself am not happy with that. I think Ukraine is really demonstrating its sort of democratic credentials right now, its support for democracy. But again, you have to remember that we are analyzing democratic institutions. We have a very specific thing that we're analyzing. And so you can take a look at sort of the democratic trajectory. Let's push it back to the Maidan in 2014, right? They overthrow Yanukovych. They kind of get rid of this pro-Russian regime that's very corrupt. Poroshenko comes in, starts making these democratic reforms, but he himself is an oligarch and kind of only gets so far. There are some positive improvements. Things become more democratic. The electoral process is significantly less tilted towards one party than it was. There's more debate and discussion within civil society. These are all positive democratic trajectories. At the same time, there are all of these institutional problems that still exist within a hybrid regime like Ukraine. Judiciary is a good example. There are deeply corrupt judges within the Ukrainian judiciary, and when the anti-corruption bodies of Ukraine tried to pass legislation in parliament to basically clean up the corruption in the judiciary just shot it down. They just vetoed it by saying it's unconstitutional, you can't do this, you don't have the power to do this. And so there are all these kind of institutional problems where you have one institution fighting against another institution that makes it really challenging. It was the things I talked about with the hybrid regimes, of these challenges of how do you get out of this zone. At the same time, while Zelensky has definitely been pushing a sort of pro-democratic policy agenda, the way that his party, Servant of the People, has gone about it has been through somewhat anti-democratic measures, right? He got power. He single-handedly won a single mandate majority in parliament, and they used what was the so-called turbo mode, where without consulting with experts, without consulting with civil society, they passed all of these ostensibly democratic reforms really quickly without considering the long-term consequences of the legislation. And that is not how democracy should work. There should be deliberation. They shouldn't just put a bill up for proposal, vote on it in 10 seconds, and then pass it without giving everybody time in society to be part of the process. That's how democracies work. There should be like a comment period in which citizens can comment on legislation and read it and talk to their representatives and tell them how they want them to vote. And so there are, well, I wouldn't say like authoritarian tendencies. I would say there have been practices that are not necessarily to the highest democratic standards that we would expect. And so that's what's kind of kept Ukraine at this level. Looking at Ukraine now in 2022, it's very hard to analyze. They're a country under martial law. Men are not allowed to leave the country. They do not have freedom of movement. The Russian news sites have been basically banned. In a democratic society, you don't just outright ban foreign propaganda. You make them register under foreign agents registration. You make them jump through all these hoops to make sure that they're not spreading foreign propaganda. You don't just spread Ukrainian propaganda throughout the entire country. You have to do all these things in a democratic way, but during a wartime, how do you do that? Like, can we really fault them for declaring martial law when they're under invasion? And so it becomes this very difficult thing, because while our reports are analytical and trying to analyze based on a specific methodology, they nevertheless have symbolic power as well. And so if we were to say Ukraine is not a democracy based on our reports, that kind of undermines their whole agenda right now, their whole reason to fight for their own democracy. And so we can continue to critique them and say, here are the things that are the best democratic practices and norms that you should follow. I just wrote an article recently saying, when this war ends, we're going to need really strong democratic institutions in Ukraine to help with the sort of post-conflict Ukraine. That's one thing, but telling them that they can't, make executive decisions right now during wartime, it's not reasonable, right? And that's the problem with war is you still need to support human rights and democracy, but at the same time, it's really hard to do during a wartime when you're being invaded by an autocratic enemy.
Your reports mention corruption in Ukraine being a consistent problem that hasn't improved much. Why is that?
There's a lot of invested interest in corruption in many of these countries, not just Ukraine. And this is really a more broad problem for the entire region of you have economic elites who can use that influence, power, wealth to sway those within parliament, within the anti-corruption bodies, to not prosecute corruption to the extent that it probably should be prosecuted if they were a fully democratic country. And so it's one of these, like I said, it's one of these problems that continues to linger in this region of just unaddressed corruption. And you do see this criticism all the time, particularly within Russian propaganda, that this is some corrupt state that shouldn't exist anymore. All states have corruption. All states need to work on corruption. Corruption exists everywhere. And Ukraine is actively trying to address it. There are just a lot of roadblocks. We can point out that it's still unaddressed without saying, and still say at least they're working on it, right? And our report, this is the thing, our report is very conservative. It moves very slowly. When we analyze these countries, we're not just looking at the parliament and saying, oh, look, they passed this anti-corruption legislation. No, we're saying, okay, they passed the anti-corruption legislation. Did Zelensky sign it into law? Did the anti-corruption agencies implement it? Did it have real-world impacts on corrupt individuals or officials going to jail? Was that money recouped into the government finances? We have to wait to see the impacts of these things. We can't just kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, and that means we are quite critical in some cases, like in this case with Ukraine's corruption. But ultimately, that's what we need to do and need to see to address some of these issues is wait to see how they're implemented and how they affect real people on the ground.
Putin has not only cited corruption, but he keeps using the word Nazis to refer to the Ukrainian government and to the Azov regiment that held out for so long in Mariupol. Could you address the issue of Nazism in Ukraine? There is some indication that there have been pro-Nazi people in Ukraine, but it's not a very common viewpoint. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, Ukraine does not need to be denazified. That is Russian propaganda, and it seems to be working because a lot of people seem to believe it. No, I mean, every country has neo-Nazis. Every country has nationalists. I mean, you can look at the Azov Battalion and how they are extreme Ukrainian nationalists, just like we have extreme American nationalists in America. And I'm not trying to get into like whataboutism, but I'm just saying that we need to have a clear understanding of who these organizations are, even if they are extremists, to really be accurate in kind of understanding their ideology and approach to the system and governance and human rights and approach to their fellow citizens. Because if we just start lumping them all in together, we kind of lose the nuance that we need to understand how to address the issue. If we just say they're all neo-Nazis, well, we have a plan for how we address neo-Nazis in the world. But if that's not what they are, if they're really just Ukrainian nationalists, then it takes a different strategy. We have to understand what it is that they're asking for, and so that we can work with them or we can reject them based on sort of us as a society deciding that it's not okay within a democratic civil society. And so, you know, even the question, I just want to be like, let's not get into it because it's not true. It's like, let's stop talking about it because it's just spreading the misinformation further. But no, they're not Ukrainian government is not a Nazi state run by fascists. Zelensky himself is Jewish and has pushed back on these neo-Nazis for years. So it's, I don't know. It's ridiculous is all. I can't but help just laugh at it.
You've referred to some of the limitations on democracy in Ukraine. You appear to have given scores to the Donbass and Crimea regions. Would you contrast them to Ukraine as much less democratic?
Yeah, so this is actually something that we don't do in our Nations in Transit report, but we do this in our Freedom in the World report. We look at sort of these frozen conflict zones, let's say, like Eastern Donbass, like Crimea, like Transnistria in Moldova, like Nagorno-Karabakh in the Caucasus. And what we're trying to analyze is the rights and freedoms experienced by people on the ground, not at what these governments are doing. And so the rights and freedoms experienced by people in the Eastern Donbass under Russian occupation are significantly curtailed compared to those in parts of Ukraine where it's controlled by the Ukrainian government. In Crimea, they're under Russian law. And so they're sort of following the Russian autocratic playbook in that they don't have the same civil rights and liberties that Ukrainian citizens do. And so we're not trying to make a political statement. We do believe that, you know, Ukraine or Crimea is part of Ukraine, that the Eastern Donbass is part of Ukraine. But nevertheless, what we're trying to analyze is what it is like to be a citizen or an individual in that part of the world. And there is a qualitative difference between living in Nagorno-Karabakh versus living in Armenia, or living in Abkhazia versus living in Georgia or South Ossetia. There are all these places where the governance system and the institutions that exist are just not providing for the same that they are under, say, the territory controlled by the government in power. And so, again, it's just our desire to be accurate and to accurately describe what is happening and what people are experiencing in the world. And that requires nuance. That requires, you know, saying, yes, we are analyzing this region differently because, frankly, de facto, these people are experiencing a different set of freedoms and political rights.
One of our audience members noticed that Kyrgyzstan was green in your map, and asks what led to the rise of the recent change to green there.
Can somebody fact check that really quick? Like, pull up your phone, type in "freedom in the world Kyrgyzstan," and see if it is, because I think it's partly free, or maybe not free. Maybe we're thinking Mongolia. No, it could be Kyrgyzstan. So Kyrgyzstan is an interesting case where they've had kind of a strong civil society. They've had somewhat of an independent media, despite the fact that they have kind of a semi-consolidated autocratic government for many years. They have these leaders who come in and kind of tilt the scales to benefit themselves at the expense of the rest of society, but the rest of society still has much of their sort of civil liberties. Maybe they don't have the same political rights. They can't elect their leaders in the same way that we can in a free country, but at least they can move around. At least they can change jobs very easily. At least they're not subject to restrictions on religion like in some of the other Central Asian countries. And so until recently, at least, Kyrgyzstan has been sort of this kind of island of democratic hope within Central Asia and sort of the autocratic regions of Eurasia. But recently, with Sadr Japarov coming into power in 2020, some of you may remember the parliamentary elections in which there was all this chaos, there was all this fraud. It caused this huge unrest within the country that let this one kind of nationalist, Kyrgyz nationalist guy basically was freed from jail and he became president within like 3 months. And he has reshaped the system, as I said, to become less democratic, to really even curtail some of these social freedoms. So he's really cracking down now on civil society and the ability of independent media to do their work. He's just basically copying Russian legislation and proposing it to the parliament, which he controls. So it's not exactly the most shining example of democracy in the region, though it is relatively more democratic than these others that are just, there's no democracy whatsoever.
Well, thank you. I think most of us in this room are probably almost totally ignorant about the stands, so to speak, the Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Anyway, I can't even remember all the stand names, but it's good to know that you're keeping an eye on them. This is an interesting question from a different perspective. Is there a correlation between full democracy and the systems of campaign finance?
I don't know. I don't think we've done that analysis. It's a really good question. I mean, we do analyze electoral processes by and large. And are they giving equal participation to citizens, right? The things that we want. And so it's kind of already baked into our analysis of how free elections are, what is the what kind of outside forces have control of electoral processes through, massive donations that somehow count as free speech. It's a really good question. I would say there's probably some correlation, but it would break down once you get into the autocracies, because it's just so vastly skewed. Sure, they have laws on the books that say you can only finance so much, but then autocratic parties can just kind of work their way around any of these things. They're not like actually beholden to the laws that they themselves have created. It's just to kind of keep any opposition out of possibility. And Russia's a really good example of that, where they just continue they have elections, right? Like people go and vote, but they continue to warp the system such that they throw Navalny in jail. They disenfranchise roughly 1/9 of the entire population who are now banned from running for office. That's actually more than were banned from running for office in the Soviet Union. They have complete control of the media sector, so all of the coverage goes to United Russia and Putin's allies. So opposition never gets any coverage. And then, of course, the finances. Like they have complete control of the financial system, and so they can use the state's coffers to boost their electoral campaign while others are banned from spending any money. There are very specific restrictions about how you can spend money if you're not allied with the party. And so, at the top, yes, we have our problems, but it looks way different at the bottom. And so it'd be difficult to kind of make a strong correlation. You'd have to kind of break it out by democracies, hybrid regimes, and autocracies and look at it from there. And that's why I talk about how hybrids and autocracies are analytically distinct from democracies. Autocracies are not just the opposite or antithesis of democracy. They are their own beasts. Like, they are their own unit of analysis, and there are just really interesting scholars like looking into this right now. You can go and read about how these systems, it's not just the absence of democratic institutions, it's how these institutions operate within autocracies, because all of these institutions exist within autocracies. Russia has a national government, it has a parliament, it has a judiciary, it has a media sector, it has civil society, but the ways that they operate are analytically distinct. It's not just the opposite of what happens in democracies. And I think it's important to remember that, to think clearly about what is happening in these places so we can address those problems with accurate information. And that's what I try to do, is to inform all of you and politicians and policymakers about what is really happening so we can get to the heart of it.
Bob from Hanover, one of our remote responses, I think. Is there any correlation of the rise of authoritative, I think that means autocratic nations, and the laziness or lack of involvement of citizens participating in voting in those nations? In other words, does lazy voters or people who fail to vote help build autocracies?
I don't know that there's a direct relation between that, because it's kind of a chicken and an egg thing, right? Are voters lazy or stop voting because they view the elections as flawed, or are the elections flawed because the voters view them, because the voters don't go? So I think there's a lot of disenchantment with politics and elections because we see how, in many cases, politics doesn't always deliver the way that we expect it to. Like, we expect we vote in the people that we want, and they go and make the changes that we want. Sorry, that's not how democracies work. Democracies are actually really slow moving, and it's a really deliberative process. Yes, there are times where we need to act fast and address big issues. Climate change is a really good example of that. It'd be great if we could get together and just really act really quickly and get this fixed. But because things move slow, it does create sort of this, well, democracy, elections, like, it's not really changing anything in my everyday life. And that creates this sort of disenchantment by which people stop voting, which then creates a less responsive government because less people are electing our representatives, and so they're less representative of the entire population, and thus doing things for like a small minority of the population and passing really extreme laws that everybody doesn't like, and that causes even more disenchantment. And so it's this like vicious cycle that we get kind of stuck in. But you take the opposite side, take what in autocracies, like, are voters being disenchanted the cause of Putin? No, because they never really had any choice to begin with. The elections were fraudulent from the get-go. He had all of these advantages from, kind of being nominated as Yeltsin's successor that really they had no choice. We still have a choice, right? We just need to mobilize, organize, talk to our friends. Like, when people say vote, they don't just mean go out and vote. They mean talk to people, persuade them that your position is right and that they should vote for your candidate. But they don't have that option in autocracies, right? They can vote for whoever they want, but one, they can be punished for who they vote for, and two, the authorities can say, fake the vote, basically. There's actually like fake voting in Russia. So they're trying this new electronic voting system. Electronic voting can be super safe and super secure. Estonia is a fantastic example of that, where a vast majority of the country just votes online for all their elections. But Russia is now implementing this because it's a new way to control what happens in the end. And so they've rolled this out in like a few big cities like Moscow. And in-person voting, you see kind of like an even split between sort of the opposition and the Putin parties. But then they add in the electronic votes, and it's just so skewed towards Putin's allies that there's just evidence that it's been manipulated. Like, if you do the statistical analysis, which people smarter than me have done, you can see the evidence that this has been manipulated data. Whereas in America, we've done the analysis and we've shown that there's no evidence of fraud, or very little evidence of fraud. And so it's really interesting to kind of think about this from the different perspectives, and how disengagement causes bad things to happen, which causes further disengagement. It's complicated.
So Putin's margin of victory in the last election went up substantially because of electronic voting? So
it came down a little bit. It's complicated. They've built an electoral system that both has it's split. So you vote both for a party and an individual in your zone, in your district. And so that enables him to kind of gain more control of the various votes. But he's introduced this electronic voting that allows him to manipulate elections where the opposition still has a chance at the local level. He doesn't have complete control. He didn't have complete control. At the local level, you'll have independent candidates, like one in the entire country, win a local election, get on the Moscow City Council, and be able to be a voice for independence. But now they've implemented all of these sort of technical changes that allow them to basically fake the vote count. But they don't just say, oh, Putin won 100% of the vote. This isn't Turkmenistan where they do that, right? They give the illusion of democracy by saying, well, he won 67% of the vote, a resounding victory for Putin, but not everybody voted for him, so we're clearly a democracy. There's difference of opinion here. But in reality, that's not what the actual vote count would show if you had a real free and fair election in Russia. So it's, again, I've said this many times today, it's deeply concerning.
Well, let's talk about sanctions for a minute. Shell companies have widely been used to hide ownership of the assets of Russian oligarchs and others who have violated democracy and human rights. How effective can sanctions be if ownership is so easily hidden?
It's a really good question. Transnational kleptocracy is a huge thing that we are trying to figure out right now. There's a lot of great people, particularly in DC, that are trying to figure this out. How do we fix it? Oh, I don't know. Again, I don't know how to fix these problems. I just know that they are a problem. I mean, we have these shell corporations in the U.S. They're revealed during like the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers. We see how these oligarchs are, funneling money out of their own countries and putting them in these offshore accounts. And basically the government needs to give itself the power to go after these things, right? They should give themselves the authority to go after, if Putin is putting money in a South Dakotan bank, like they should have the ability to go after that and see that. It shouldn't be hidden from American authorities. Like we should be able to go after, and we are increasingly seeing legislation that's letting us do that. We're able to sanction these individuals. It's not perfect. There's still places in the world where they can put their money, but at least, we're making progress towards figuring out how to address this problem right now.
Well, you mentioned South Dakota. I think I've seen evidence that South Dakota is trying to become an offshore shelter for people who are trying to avoid taxes and identification.
Yeah, it's South Dakota. We know about Delaware having like these kind of loosey-goosey laws that make it easy to kind of hide money. But, I mean, what do we do about that? We have to vote. We have to elect representatives who are going to change the laws that allow this kind of thing to happen, right? So go talk to your friends in South Dakota and say, hey, elect a person who's not going to let some Russian oligarch put money in your banks there. It's not good for democracy. That's what we have to do.
Does Freedom House suggest that we should not do business with countries that are suppressing democracy and human rights?
It's interesting, yeah. We're increasingly working directly with the sort of business community, recognizing that the role that they play in supporting human rights around the world, like Facebook, Google, Amazon, just by kind of doing business in these climates, they basically are perpetuating a lot of the abuses that some of these autocratic regimes are pushing on their citizens. And so we're increasingly trying to think about how do we have a democratically minded business sector? What are the changes that these businesses can do to make sure that their business model and their operations are supporting human rights and democracy? Because ultimately, again, it's good for them. It's not good when Facebook is being fined millions of dollars every day by the Russian government, which they are. It would be much better if they had thought of this a long time ago. And so this is something that's kind of like new thinking of how do we make sure that business is being done in a way that is furthering the goal of democracy and freedom in the world. It's not something I'm an expert on, but we have an entire advocacy team that's thinking through this stuff right now and talking to business leaders.
So if we start restricting business practices in countries that don't respect human rights, what do we do about China?
not an expert on China. I know I said this last night. Don't get me talking about China, because I'll say something that's probably untrue. No, it's a good question. We talked about this we're so economically interconnected with China that if China were to invade Taiwan, could we realistically sanction the entire Chinese economy in the way that we've done with Russia? We're not that connected to Russia economically. Europe is. They're feeling the pain of that. But would Americans be willing to suffer the economic pain to support an independent Taiwan? Would you all? I think it's a real question that we all need to be thinking about. Are we willing to accept personal pain to support the democratic trajectory of a country that's not our own? And right now in Europe, we're seeing how they're doing that for Ukraine. They're willing to suffer to a certain extent. Yes, they have not cut off the gas and oil from Russia, but they have sanctioned them in other things that are hurting their economies. And when it comes to China, it's a real question of, what do we do about this? I mean, that's we talked about this, of maybe one of the good things about the Trump administration was recognizing how our overdependence on China is actually like a national security threat to us and to support for democracy around the world. How do you undo that without causing great economic and social upheaval within your own country? It's a challenge that I know other more intelligent China researchers are thinking about.
Well, we're running short on time, but I wanted to slip in one more question in your home territory. Poland is pulling away from democratic norms, curtailing the check on powers of the Law and Justice Party, particularly in the courts. Yet it is a refuge for refugees from Ukraine and a bulwark against Russia. So it's very important to our foreign policy desires to help protect Ukraine from Russian aggression. Must we let Poland become less democratic because it's aligned with us?
Yeah, I always struggle with the framing of either this or that. I want to push this idea of yes and. Yes, we should absolutely support what Poland is doing to support Ukraine, all the aid that they're giving, all of the refugees that they're housing. At the same time, we should also be able to call them out for their democratic deficiencies. Like, if we're good democratic partners, if you're in a marriage with somebody, you should be able to tell them when they're doing something wrong, right? You can still love them and tell them what they're doing is not the right thing.
Well, they've been attacking the EU and
Absolutely.
Complaining about Brussels and collecting money from the EU. There's been some talk about curtailing the money paid to them because of their anti-democratic practices.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard much of that since the invasion of Ukraine.
No, there has been, actually. So recently, the annual Rule of Law report was released, I think about 2 weeks ago, and it called out Poland and Hungary as these two bad actors of violating rule of law and respect for human rights within the EU. And this is notable because they're doing it while there's a war going on, right? So they're calling out their allies and their friends, despite the fact that they are also doing good things in Ukraine. And in the case of Poland, they've come up with this checklist of things that they need to do, right, to improve their own democracy. And it's, we still have to see the implementation of that and what that looks like. Some say it's not enough, like they need to cut off the money now. And we see this actually more seriously in the case of Hungary, where the EU is very seriously considering, or already has, cut off some money to Hungary as a result of what they're doing. I mean, they're violating, again, like the basic principles of the EU, of this sort of democratic institution. And so you want to get them in line without pushing them outside the alliance, right? You don't want there to be like a pole exit. It's not, I don't think there will be a pole exit. There's not, there's still very strong support for the EU within Poland. And so, they'll continue to call out these democratic deficiencies because they're also signaling to the citizenry of Poland that, hey, your government's not behaving the way it should domestically. Sure, it's doing great work internationally with the war effort, but you as Polish citizens need to be thinking seriously about the democratic trajectory of your own country. And so I think just calling out these things sometimes is so necessary. Like, America needs to do a better job of this, calling out our allies when they are not meeting up to democratic practices and norms and principles, and they need to call us out when we're not living up to the standards of democratic society. This is just so important. That's what makes a good society, is helping each other improve, like helping everybody rise up and become more democratic. There's still a lot of work to do, and we can do it together. We just have to be willing to have those tough conversations.
Well, we've run out of time, and I think we should call this to a halt. Maybe if anybody wanted to catch up with Mike afterwards, you can grab him for a few minutes before he has to go to lunch.
We want to thank both Rob and Mike for a very exciting morning. And I want to remind you all that next week will be our last week of 2022's summer lecture series, and we'll hear about Can America Govern Itself from Nolan McCarty. Thank you.